At the dawn of the 9th century, what would become England was a fragmented patchwork of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, each with its own rivalries and ambitions. Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex. These were the pillars of a land that, though rich in culture and Christian faith, was politically disunited and vulnerable. A treacherous calm hung over its shores, an illusion of peace that would soon be shattered by a force emerging from the mists of the North Sea, the Vikings. These were no mere pirates seeking quick plunder. They were ruthless warriors, brutal colonizers, and, to many, the very embodiment of pagan terror. Their long ships, with prows carved with dragons' heads, glided silently through the icy waters, foreboding doom. The arrival of the Vikings was not an isolated event, but a wave of raids that grew more intense with each passing year. At first, small raiding parties struck at coastal monasteries, rich in treasure and unprotected. Lindisfarne Monastery in 793 was the first major blow, a shock to Western Christendom, which saw its shrines desecrated. But the scale of the threat quickly grew. It was not long before these raids grew into large armies, with thousands of warriors landing en masse, not just to plunder, but to conquer and settle. They sought fertile land, wealth, and above all, dominion. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, unprepared for such a large-scale war and disunited in their own intrigues, saw their defenses crumble one after another. The English landscape was on the brink of irreversible transformation, a land that might soon be ruled by Norse gods and foreign languages. The air, once thick with the smell of peat and fresh bread, now carried the stench of smoke and blood, a prelude to the nightmare that was to befall the island. The arrival of the great heathen army in the mid-9th century was not just a threat, but a death sentence for the Anglo-Saxon structure that had existed for centuries. These were no longer isolated raids, but a systematic campaign of conquest. The brutal and efficient Norse warriors were not content with plundering. They destroyed. Entire villages were reduced to ashes, their wooden and straw buildings burning furiously in the night, lighting up the sky with a dawn of destruction. The sound of the screams of the innocent mingled with the roar of the conquerors, the clang of metal, and the crackling of flames that consumed homes and lives. Anglo-Saxon fortifications, often made of palisades of wood and earth, while effective against small raids, proved insufficient in the face of Viking ingenuity and ferocity. Towns, once centers of trade and faith, became targets. Their churches, filled with gold and silver objects, were desecrated and looted, and their inhabitants massacred or enslaved. The sense of despair was palpable, a terror that spread faster than the Viking hordes themselves. Anglo-Saxon kings, once sovereign in their small domains, were captured, humiliated, and executed in brutally symbolic ways, such as the Blood Eagle, a legendary torture designed to demoralize any resistance. The downfall of Edmund of East Anglia, martyred for refusing to renounce his faith, became a grim reminder of the fate of those who defied the new warlords. The Viking warriors, mostly men between the ages of 20 and 40, sported thick, braided beards, blue or gray eyes hardened by life at sea and in battle, and armor ranging from tanned leather to wrought metal. They wielded two-handed axes that swung down with devastating force, sharp swords and long spears, and moved with an almost supernatural ferocity. Their shield wall tactics were nearly impenetrable in open ground, and their mobility on rivers and seas allowed them to strike with surprise, disappearing and reappearing where least expected. England, once a kingdom of churches and green fields, was becoming a graveyard of kingdoms and a testament to the ruthlessness of an invasion that seemed endless. The smell of death and destruction hung over the land, and hope was a flickering flame, about to be snuffed out by the icy wind from the north. As the northern and eastern kingdoms of England fell one by one, only one bastion of Anglo-Saxon resistance remained, the Kingdom of Wessex, located in the southwest. Unlike its neighbors, Wessex, with its natural borders of dense forests and marshes, and a more defensible coastline, managed to hold out longer. But this was no impenetrable fortress. It was, in effect, a besieged island, constantly besieged by the relentless Viking armies that had already established themselves in the conquered territories. The map of England at that time was a visual testament to Norse hegemony. The areas shaded red represented the vast and growing Viking domain, the Danelaw, where Norse law and custom were beginning to take root. Wessex, on the other hand, stood out in green, a small speck of Christian and Anglo-Saxon hope amid a sea of paganism and foreign occupation. The kings of Wessex, including Alfred's brothers, had fought bravely, but superior numbers and ruthless Viking strategy were taking their toll. Each winter, the great heathen army would quarter itself in conquered lands, consolidating its power, while in the spring they would advance again, nibbling at Wessex's borders, testing its defenses and draining its resources. The people of Wessex lived in constant tension, knowing that at any moment their homes could be attacked, their churches desecrated, and their lives turned upside down. Diplomacy failed. Attempts at peace were seen as weakness, and the only language the Vikings seemed to understand was that of the sword. The belief that God had abandoned the Anglo-Saxons was beginning to spread, and many saw the arrival of the Vikings as divine punishment. Wessex was more than a mere kingdom. It was the last flame of a cultural and religious identity that was about to be snuffed out. It was the home of a royal lineage that stretched back to the first Anglo-Saxon settlers, and the repository of the last hopes of a people. The stories of their ancestors, the songs of their saints and kings, all seemed about to disappear beneath the Norse advance. The fight in Wessex was not just for territory, but for the very soul of England. And amid this impending darkness, a young prince, untested by the depths of defeat and leadership, was about to inherit a burden few would dare even contemplate. Far from the ravaged battlefields and burning cities that engulfed Anglo-Saxon England, young Alfred was born in 849 in the royal village of Wantage in Berkshire, a relative oasis of calm amid the storm that was sweeping across the island. He was the youngest son of King Ethelwulf of Wessex, and as such the prospect of him ever sitting on the throne was remote. His four older brothers, Athelstan, Ethelbald, Ethelbert, and Ethelred, were at the head of the line of succession, and it was up to them to defend the kingdom against the growing Viking threat. Alfred's childhood, therefore, was not initially marked by the pressures of power, but by an atmosphere that mixed the rigidity of the royal court with the serenity of a noble home. Although his family was an active military force in the fight against the invaders, the environment in which Alfred grew up allowed him to enjoy an unusual education for an Anglo-Saxon prince of the time. While his brothers were trained in the arts of war, the use of sword and shield, the leadership of troops and combat strategies, Alfred, often in poor health, he is known to have suffered from a chronic illness, possibly Crohn's disease, which would be with him throughout his life, found solace and passion in his studies. There was a tranquility to his immediate surroundings that contrasted sharply with the chaos and violence that raged beyond the borders of Wessex. Images of a young Alfred, aged 8 or 12, with light brown hair and alert blue eyes, might show him sitting in a candlelit chamber, bent over a scroll. Perhaps he was not just reading but being instructed by a wise Anglo-Saxon cleric, the teaching father figure who would introduce him to the vast world of knowledge. In the simple garb of a nobleman, he absorbed lessons in Latin, theology, history, and philosophy, knowledge that was rare even among the royalty of his day. This dedication to study, atypical for a future warrior king, would shape his mind profoundly, preparing him in ways no one could have foreseen for the challenges that life and the fate of his people had in store for him. This contrast between the violence of the outdoors and the quiet of his apprenticeship is crucial. The warrior that England desperately needed was being forged not just on the battlefield, but in the hushed halls of study. It was a dark time for the kingdom, but a formative one for its savior. In an England ravaged by Viking invasions, education was often secondary to the pressing need to defend the borders and survive. The training of an Anglo-Saxon prince, especially in a royal family as war-torn as that of Wessex, was primarily focused on the military arts: how to lead men, how to handle weapons, and how to resist attacks. However, Alfred, the youngest of Ethelwulf's royal offspring, deviated markedly from this norm. His passion for scholarship and the pursuit of knowledge was evident from an early age, distinguishing him from his brothers, who were more inclined toward physical combat. A close-up of the hands of a young Alfred, perhaps 15 or 16, his slender, elegant fingers gripping a goose quill, meticulously tracing letters on parchment, would be a powerful image. He was not wielding a heavy sword or holding a shield, but rather the scribe's tool, the weapon of the mind. His blue eyes, hardened by the trials of kingship, shone with an insatiable curiosity as he delved into Latin and Anglo-Saxon texts. This engagement with scholarship was not a distraction, but an intrinsic part of his education. Contrary to the popular belief that brute strength was the sole measure of a leader, Alfred was developing a deeper understanding of the world, of law, theology, and strategy that would prove invaluable in his future leadership. Although not a monk, Alfred had a deep reverence for learning and the Christian faith. He not only studied but also memorized texts, recited poems, and sought the wisdom of the learned. His spiritual and intellectual mentor was probably a cleric, perhaps Swethin, Bishop of Winchester, who introduced him to the great thinkers of the day and to the fundamentals of governance. This immersion in the world of letters, in an era when literacy was rare even among the nobility, gave Alfred a unique perspective. He understood that the true strength of a kingdom lay not only in its military muscle, but also in its cultural cohesion, the wisdom of its leaders, and the ability to record and preserve its own legacy. This unexpected education prepared him to be a different kind of king, not just a defender of borders, but a guardian of culture, a visionary who knew that rebuilding a nation depended as much on the sword as the pen. Anglo-Saxon England was on the brink of collapse, but the young prince, with his sharp mind and passion for learning, was quietly arming himself with the intellectual tools necessary for his eventual salvation. The line of succession to the throne of Wessex was clear, and young Alfred, as the youngest son, was far from the heir apparent. His 4 elder brothers, Athelstan, Ethelbald, Ethelbert, and finally Ethelred, were the ones who bore the burden of the crown and the responsibility of defending the kingdom against the growing and relentless Viking threat. While Alfred devoted himself to his studies, fate seemed to be preparing his brothers for sacrifice, turning the throne of Wessex into an unstable chair, a succession of short and violent reigns, each costing the life of a prince. One can imagine a dramatic sequence of images, alternating between close-ups of his brothers, men in their 20s and 30s with varying hair and eyes, but all with the same look of fierce determination on their faces, dressed in Anglo-Saxon armor that at first looked new, and then became increasingly stained with blood and mud. They are seen fighting in the chaos of battle, with swords and axes gleaming in the English sun, and the sound of shields clashing echoing through the air. Ethelbald and Ethelbert reigned and fought briefly, focusing on the defense of the kingdom. But it was under the reign of Ethelred, their immediate elder brother, that the intensity of the war against the great heathen army reached its peak. The 870s saw the fighting become a matter of survival. Ethelred and Alfred fought side by side in several bloody battles, such as Ashdown and Reading, where despite some tactical victories, Anglo-Saxon losses were heavy. The sight of their once strong and spirited brothers falling on the battlefield, slain by Viking blades, would be a vivid reminder of the high cost of defending the realm. The throne of Wessex was not a coveted prize, but a dangerous burden, a curse for those who occupied it in the front line against the pagans. Alfred's forced succession in 871, after Ethelred's death, exhausted and possibly wounded in battle, was not a triumphant accession, but an imposition of fate. He did not seek power. Power, in his most desperate hour, fell to him. The dark omen of his brother's deaths echoed, making it clear that Alfred inherited not only a kingdom, but a nearly lost war, and the fate of his people on his shoulders, a burden no one expected the young, studious prince to carry. The year 878 was undoubtedly the low point of Alfred's life and reign. After years of grueling fighting against the Danes, the kingdom of Wessex, the last Anglo-Saxon stronghold, seemed finally doomed. In the winter of that year, the Vikings, led by the cunning Guthrum, launched a surprise and devastating attack on Chippenham, a crucial royal stronghold. Wessex's defense crumbled. Alfred's army was scattered, and hope was dashed in panic. To avoid capture and likely humiliating execution, Alfred was forced to do the unthinkable for a king: flee. He became a fugitive, a king without a crown, a leader without an army, seeking refuge in the remote and inhospitable Athelney marshes in Somerset. These lands, a maze of reeds, Stagnant waters and small islands of dry land were perfect for hiding, but also a brutal symbol of his humiliation. We can picture Alfred, a man, 20-30, light brown hair and blue eyes, now dirty, tired, and unshaven, wearing simple, torn peasant clothes so as not to be recognized, exhausted, his face gaunt and lined with deprivation and anxiety. He is isolated, with perhaps only a small group of loyal followers, men and women alike helpless, sharing his misery. The atmosphere is one of abject despair and profound loneliness, an oppressive silence broken only by the murmur of the marsh and the mournful song of the birds. The contrast between the majesty of a king and the abjection of a fugitive was stark. Alfred, who had once commanded armies and reigned in grand halls, now lived in squalid conditions, barely eating enough, constantly on the lookout for Viking patrols. His mind, once devoted to strategy and law, now focused on basic survival. This personal humiliation was also a moment of profound reflection. It was in this isolation, stripped of all royal pomp, that Alfred had the opportunity to reevaluate his faith, his leadership, and the fate of his people. The legend of his sojourn at Athelney suggests that he found strength and inspiration in his adversity. This seemingly final downfall would in fact prove to be the crucible in which his resilience would be forged, preparing him for the greatest turnaround of his life and the salvation of England. Athelney, from the refuge of a defeated king, would become the birthplace of a phoenix. Amid the darkness and desolation of his exile on the Athelney marshes came one of the most famous and endearing anecdotes about Alfred the Great, the legend of the burnt cakes. Although its historicity is debatable, it was probably a folktale intended to humanize the king and emphasize his humility. It perfectly captures the spirit of that period of profound humiliation and isolation. The story goes that Alfred, disguised as a simple peasant to avoid recognition and capture by the Vikings, sought refuge in the humble hut of a woman and her husband. We can visualize an intimate and somewhat comical scene. Alfred, a man in his 20s or 30s with light brown hair and dusty blue eyes, a stubble that partially hides his real face, and the simple rustic clothes of a common man, is sitting near a fireplace. His expression, however, is not that of a relaxed peasant. Instead, he is deep in thought, his eyes fixed on the flames, but his mind is far away, lost in war strategies, the fate of his kingdom, and the desperate situation of his people. He does not notice the task he has been given, to tend to the cakes that are baking in the fire. The peasant woman, a woman in her 40s or 50s with work-hardened hands, rustic clothes, and an expression of weary exasperation, enters the hut, and upon seeing the charred cakes, bursts out in rebuke. "Are you so busy with your thoughts that you cannot even turn my cakes, even though you are willing to eat them when they are hot?" she would say, her voice full of impatience and without any reverence for what she believed to be a mere lazy stranger. Alfred's face, previously thoughtful, changes to one of surprise, embarrassment, and perhaps a touch of self-reproach at his distraction. The touch of human humor in the scene is palpable, a comic relief amid the tension of war and flight. This legend not only humanizes Alfred, showing him to be fallible and subject to the rebukes of a common woman, but also highlights his almost obsessive dedication to the affairs of the kingdom, to the point of ignoring mundane tasks. More than that, the story serves as a reminder that even in his lowest and most humble moments, Alfred's mind was always on his people and his kingdom. From his supposed failure to turn the cakes would emerge the resilience and tactical genius that would lead him to turn the tide against the Viking invaders and pave the way for the salvation of a nation. Athelney, despite its poverty, became the crucible in which Alfred's character was forged. And if this story surprised you, and you're curious to know how a fugitive and absent-minded king became England's greatest leader, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our epic chapters in history, and share it with all your friends who need to know this legend. Your help is crucial for us to spread the knowledge to more people. And out of pure curiosity, where are you watching this saga from? Let us know in the comments. We love to know where our community is tuning in from. After months of exile and brooding on the marshes of Athelney, Alfred the Great emerged not as a defeated and despairing king, but as a phoenix rising from the ashes of his own burning kingdom. His humiliation did not break him. Instead, it served as a catalyst for steely determination and renewed vision. What followed was one of the greatest acts of resilience and leadership in English history. Athelney, from a fugitive's hideout, became a secret command center where Alfred's last loyalists gathered, whispering plans for a seemingly impossible counteroffensive. We see a dramatic close-up of Alfred's face, now a man in his 20s or 30s, with his light brown hair slicked back, blue eyes shining with a cold, unwavering determination, and a trimmed beard that gives him an air of gravity. He is dressed in Anglo-Saxon armor that, though simple, is impeccably clean and well-groomed, a striking contrast to his ragged peasant garb. His gaze, piercing and focused, reflects the clarity of his mind and the strength of his will. There is no longer a trace of distraction or despair, only the resilience of a leader who understood that the salvation of his people depended entirely on their ability to overcome adversity. He knew he needed to kindle a spark of hope in hearts that were still discouraged. His messengers, moving secretly through the still loyal territories, spread the word. King Alfred was alive, and he was calling for every man in Wessex and western Mercia who could bear arms. The call was not just to war, but to defend their faith, their families, and their very existence. It was a call for the survival of a people. From hidden villages and isolated farmsteads, men of all ages with rusty swords and patched shields began to converge. With each passing day, Alfred's small force grew, fueled by faith in their king and the desperate need to fight for a future. They gathered at Egbert's Stone, a secret rallying point that became the epicenter of the Anglo-Saxon revolt. The mood of the scene would be one of cautious optimism, mixed with the urgency of the situation. The sun perhaps would break through the heavy clouds, bathing Alfred's face in symbolic light as he emerged from the shadows. This was the phoenix being reborn, not just as a man, but as the unbreakable spirit of a kingdom. Alfred, the one-time fugitive, was now ready to lead his people in their darkest hour, to face the great heathen army, and against all odds, to fight for the very soul of England. The Battle of Edington, fought in May 878, was not just another engagement in the long and bloody Anglo-Saxon war against the Vikings. It was the decisive turning point, the moment when the tide of Danish invasion finally met an impregnable barrier. After weeks of gathering his forces and meticulously planning his strategy in the Athelney marshes, Alfred led his army, growing by the day with men thirsting for revenge and freedom, into the heart of Viking territory, near present-day Edington in Wiltshire. The battle was inevitable, and the survival of Wessex and perhaps of the entire Anglo-Saxon culture depended on its outcome. Picture an aerial view of the battlefield, a vast, verdant expanse of land beneath a dramatic sky, with heavy clouds that seem to reflect the weight of the moment. On the animated map, two large formations of miniature armies, Alfred's Anglo-Saxons in green, disciplined and cohesive, and Guthrum's Vikings in red, numerous and seemingly invincible, move slowly, inexorably toward each other. The movement arrows on the map pulsed, indicating the rising tension. The atmosphere on the field was one of tense anticipation, a calm before the storm that would erupt into brutal fury. Alfred, his tactical genius already evident, positioned his troops masterfully. He knew that the Vikings' strength lay in their initial overwhelming charge and their feared shield wall. To counter this, he needed a tactic that would unsettle this formation. His men, though outnumbered, were united by a common cause and an unshakable faith in their king. They had marched for days, driven by the memory of burned lands and lost kin. The clash of the two forces was monumental, a clash of metal on metal, war cries and the throwing of spears. The sound of battle would be deafening, a cacophony of epic violence. The focus of the battle, for the viewer, would be on the formations. The Anglo-Saxons held a firm defensive line, absorbing the initial impact of the Vikings, while Alfred's men, trained in a discipline superior to that of the Vikings, managed to maintain cohesion. The turning point came when Alfred, in command, orchestrated a flanking maneuver, perhaps with a wing of his cavalry or light infantry, striking the unsuspecting Vikings. Alfred's tactical superiority was manifested in his men's ability to move and react in a coordinated manner, something the Vikings, though fierce, often lacked in prolonged battles. Edington was not just a military victory. It was a victory of strategy, resilience, and belief in the leadership of a king who, against all odds, refused to bow. England and Alfred were on the brink of their greatest upset. The victory at Edington was not the result of mere luck or overwhelming brute force. It was an eloquent testament to the tactical genius of Alfred the Great, a mind that, despite his more academic background, revealed itself to be a first-rate military strategist. In the heat of battle, where chaos and adrenaline reigned supreme, Alfred maintained a remarkable calm, his mind functioning like a precise machine, calculating every move, anticipating the enemy's reactions, and exploiting their vulnerabilities. We can imagine a dynamic sequence of close-ups of Alfred, male, 20-30 years old, light brown hair, blue eyes shining with a cold, calculating intelligence, his Anglo-Saxon armor clean and untarnished, contrasting with the sweat and dust of battle. His lips move in short, precise commands, his hands gesture with unwavering determination. He is not on the front line wielding a sword. He is on an elevated position, perhaps on a small hill, surveying the entire panorama of the battle like a chess master at his board. The arrows and formations on the animated map, superimposed on the real scene of the battlefield, graphically illustrate his strategic moves. The way his Anglo-Saxon shield wall holds firm under the Viking attack, absorbing the impact, and how, at the right moment, one wing of his troops breaks away for an unexpected flanking movement, surprising the Danes. Alfred understood the psychology of his enemies. He knew that the Vikings, while fearsome in a frontal assault and close combat, could be unsettled by tactics that broke their formation and caught them off guard. His strategy at Edington was a classic example of this. He allowed the Vikings to wear themselves down against his defensive line, then launched a lateral charge that disrupted the fearsome Danish shield wall formation. This maneuver was not just a physical attack, it was a psychological blow, disorienting an enemy accustomed to imposing its will through brute force. Alfred's leadership was based not only on his imposing presence, but on the clarity of his orders and the ability of his men to trust his strategic vision. Every decision, every adjustment in troop positioning, was a reflection of a mind that saw beyond mere confrontation, seeking the decisive advantage. The battle raged on, and the camera would show quick flashes of Anglo-Saxons, men 20-40, mixed hair and eyes, Anglo-Saxon armor, executing Alfred's orders with discipline, turning the flank of the Vikings, men 20-40, beards, mixed armor, who suddenly found themselves surrounded and disorganized. Alfred's tactical genius at Edington not only secured victory, but solidified his reputation as one of the greatest military leaders of his age, a king who, against all odds, knew how to use his wits as the sharpest weapon of all, saving his kingdom in the process. The clamor of the Battle of Edington, which had echoed across the Wiltshire countryside for days, finally began to change in tone. The Vikings' roar, once wild and threatening, gave way to cries of despair and confusion. The Anglo-Saxon formations, which had stood like a wall of iron and courage, now advanced, pushing back the invaders with renewed ferocity. Alfred's flanking strategy had had its devastating effect, turning the Viking shield wall into a disorganized and vulnerable mass. What had once seemed a certain victory for the Danes now became a crushing defeat. We can see striking images of the Vikings, men 20-40 years old, thickly bearded, in various armor now stained with blood and mud, retreating, their faces contorted in expressions of shock and panic. Their fearsome formations were broken, their shields cracked, and their swords fell to the ground. They ran in disorder, seeking escape, no longer invincible conquerors but broken men in flight. In contrast, the Anglo-Saxons, men 20-40 years old with various hair and eyes, their Anglo-Saxon armor also dirty from battle, but their faces lit up with a growing euphoria, pursued them with vigor, their cries of victory and Alfred echoing across the field. The celebration of victory was not just the cry of triumph in battle, it was the cry of a kingdom saved from the abyss. Alfred the Great, who had commanded with an almost supernatural calm moments before, now watched the enemy flee with an expression that mixed relief, weariness, and deep satisfaction. The scene would show him, perhaps a little dirty with mud and blood, but still imposing in his armor, surveying the battlefield. His blue eyes, previously focused on strategy, now scanned the horizon, seeing not only the Viking defeat, but the salvation of his people. The remaining Vikings, including Guthrum himself, were surrounded and forced to surrender in a nearby fortress after a siege of 14 days. The defeat was total and humiliating for the invaders. The victory at Edington marked the end of the Vikings' period of unrestrained conquest in Wessex and established Alfred not just as a king, but as a savior. The flame of hope that had almost been extinguished now burned brighter than ever. Wessex was safe, and a new chapter had begun for Anglo-Saxon England, one in which resistance would turn to reconstruction and survival to sovereignty, all thanks to the courage and tactical genius of its king. Alfred's crushing victory at Edington was not just a military triumph, it was the seed of a profound political transformation for England. After the subsequent siege of the Viking stronghold, Guthrum and the Danes were forced to accept the terms of a treaty, the historic Treaty of Wedmore, signed in 878. This was no mere temporary peace agreement, but a pact that would redefine England's borders and shape its future for centuries. England, which until then had been a hodgepodge of kingdoms often at war with each other and at the mercy of invaders, was divided in a way that, while painful for some, brought relative stability. Imagine a map of England being unveiled, where the colors are clearly and dramatically divided. Wessex and Western Mercia, which were under Alfred's control, are rendered in a vibrant green, symbolizing life, Anglo-Saxon sovereignty and recovery. In contrast, the vast regions of the east and northeast, which had been conquered and settled by the Vikings, are highlighted in a deep red, representing the territory that would come to be known as the Danelaw, the land under Danish rule. The treaty lines, drawn over rivers and landmarks, appear on the map with almost surgical precision, like scars that divided the island but also redefined it. The Treaty of Wedmore was a testament to Alfred's political acumen. He did not seek the total annihilation of an enemy that was still numerous and dangerous. Instead, he opted for a pragmatic solution: to recognize Viking rule over the lands they already occupied, in exchange for a promise of peace and, most importantly, the conversion of Guthrum and his key leaders to Christianity. An animated arrow on the map, perhaps golden and shining, traces the path of the Viking delegation to the place of conversion, symbolizing the adoption of the Christian faith, a crucial step towards integration and pacification. This was not just a religious imposition, but a strategic political move. By accepting baptism, the Vikings were integrating themselves, albeit superficially at first, into the European Christian community, making them, in theory, less inclined to plunder churches and monasteries, and more inclined to trade and coexist. The Treaty of Wedmore, then, was not just a map of division, but a map of forced coexistence, a first step towards an England that would eventually seek unification. Peace, still fragile, had arrived, and with it the opportunity for reconstruction. One of the most remarkable and politically astute aspects of the Treaty of Wedmore was Alfred's demand that Guthrum, the fearsome Viking leader of the great heathen army, and his chieftains convert to Christianity. This was no mere formality. For Alfred, a deeply religious king, it was a crucial step towards cementing peace and, in a sense, civilizing his former enemies. Guthrum's conversion was not just an act of faith or political expediency, but an event of great symbolism, one that sealed the deal and marked a new era of at least tense coexistence. Imagine a realistic and imposing scene. Guthrum, a man in his 30s or 40s with his blonde beard and blue eyes, once battle-hardened, now with an expression of resignation and perhaps a certain pragmatism, in his Viking leader's garb, kneels. He is being baptized by an Anglo-Saxon priest, a man in his 50s or 60s in simple but dignified clerical robes, his face solemn and hopeful, in a solemn ceremony, performed in some significant location, perhaps near a chapel or holy water font. In daylight that bathes the scene in a glow of new hope, the water flows over his head, a symbolic act of rebirth and acceptance of a new faith. Alfred, a man in his 20s or 30s with light brown hair and observant blue eyes, dressed in his royal robes but with a posture that conveys a mixture of gravity and satisfaction, is present, observing the scene closely. His look is not one of triumph over a humiliated enemy, but of a strategist who sees his long-term plan unfolding. He knew that Guthrum's conversion would not turn the Vikings into saints overnight, but it would make it much easier for them to coexist. It linked them to a wider European tradition, lessening the likelihood of attacks on churches and monasteries, and paving the way for future negotiations and perhaps even gradual assimilation. Guthrum, after baptism, adopted the Christian name Athelstan and became king of the Danelaw, ruling his people according to Danish law, but now under a nominally Christian mantle. Alfred and Guthrum met on other occasions, exchanging gifts and reinforcing the treaty. The scene of the conversion would therefore be a landmark, the moment when the line between enemy and ally, albeit a reluctant ally, became blurred. The peace, forged by Alfred's sword, was now sealed by the cross, promising a new era for England, an era of reconstruction and, paradoxically, of coexistence between cultures that had previously known each other only through sword and fire. The victory at Edington and the subsequent Treaty of Wedmore secured peace, but Alfred the Great was a far-sighted king who understood that this peace was fragile. The Vikings, though defeated, had not disappeared. They had established themselves in the Danelaw and could at any time resume their campaigns. It was imperative to build a defense that could withstand future assaults. Alfred's solution was revolutionary for Anglo-Saxon England, the creation of a network of strategically positioned fortresses, known as burhs. View a stunning aerial view of Aberhundar construction. These are not medieval stone castles like those we know today, but impressive Anglo-Saxon fortifications, with massive walls of wood and earth, perhaps topped with sharp wooden palisades and deep moats. Within the walls, wooden houses, barns, and workshops begin to appear, indicating that these were not just military bases, but also living communities. We can see men, Anglo-Saxons between 20 and 50 years old, of various European ethnicities, with different hair and eyes, wearing the work clothes of the period, linen tunics, woolen trousers, leather boots, their faces sweaty and concentrated, hard at work, chopping wood, digging the earth, building huts. The sound of hammers, axes, and the commanding voice of foremen echoes in the air. Alfred understood that effective defense required mobility and secure footholds. Burhs were designed to be linked by well-maintained roads, allowing troops to move quickly to reinforce any point under attack. On the animated map, a network of bright spots, burhs, stretches across Wessex and western Mercia, glowing lines connecting them, illustrating Alfred's strategic vision for a unified defense. This network was not just a shield against invaders. Each burhit also served as a vital commercial and administrative center for the region, encouraging resettlement and economic recovery. Markets flourished within its walls, protected from Viking danger, and Alfred's Anglo-Saxon coinage. He also reformed his monetary system, standardizing the weight and quality of coins and introducing a new coin, the silver penny, which became the basis of the English monetary system for centuries. The standardization of these coins, each bearing Alfred's portrait and name, not only facilitated trade, but also served as a tangible symbol of his authority and the sovereignty of his kingdom. This more stable and reliable monetary system was crucial to economic recovery and administrative unification, as it allowed for safer transactions and more efficient tax collection, was accepted throughout them, further uniting the kingdom. The construction of these fortifications represented a massive investment of time and resources, requiring an unprecedented level of organization and planning, but it was an investment that paid off. The burhs not only protected Alfred's people, they also consolidated his power, transforming Wessex from a besieged kingdom into an impregnable fortress, paving the way for the eventual unification of England. They were physical testament to the vision of a king who not only resisted, but rebuilt and reinvented the defense of his nation. Alfred's experience with the great heathen army taught him a crucial lesson. The old Anglo-Saxon military structure was inadequate to face such a persistent and numerous enemy. The traditional system of fired, a militia of free men called up to fight for a limited time, was ineffective against prolonged invasions. They would return to their farms after a few weeks, leaving the kingdom vulnerable. Alfred realized that he needed an army that never slept, a force that was constantly ready for combat. His solution was a radical military reform that would change the face of Anglo-Saxon warfare. We can picture dynamic images of soldiers training. These are not just men swinging swords haphazardly, but disciplined formations, with men, Anglo-Saxons aged between 20 and 40, with a variety of hair and eyes, dressed in more standard Anglo-Saxon armor, including chainmail and conical helmets, carrying spears and round shields, practicing in unison, moving in tight shield walls, exercising with a vigor and discipline that rivaled, if not surpassed, that of the Vikings themselves. The sound of short, sharp commands, the clang of weapons, and the sweat streaming down the faces of the engaged men fill the atmosphere. Alfredo's central reform was the division of the fyrd into two parts. While one half was on active duty, defending the burhs or on patrol, the other half could look after their lands and families. This rotation ensured that there was always a ready and trained army, without, however, ruining the agricultural economy of the kingdom. In addition, Alfred developed a force of professional knights, the thegns, men who dedicated their lives to war and the service of the king, forming a core of elite warriors. This was a significant change in a society that traditionally valued temporary militia service. These thegns were rewarded with lands and honors, creating a military class directly loyal to the king. Discipline and readiness were the watchwords of Alfred's new army. He required his men not only to be brave, but also to be intelligent and tactically proficient. They were trained in new defensive and offensive tactics, learning to use the terrain to their advantage and to fight the Vikings with their own weapons. This reorganization allowed Alfred to mobilize forces quickly to meet attacks, respond to sieges, and even launch effective counterattacks. Alfred's army was not just a collection of warriors. It was a refined war machine, a living shield for the nation. This robust and ever-vigilant force was a fundamental pillar of Wessex's security and a crucial factor in the recovery and consolidation of Anglo-Saxon power in England. Alfred the Great was a visionary who understood that the Viking threat could not be fought on land alone. The ease with which the invaders sailed on rivers and seas, landing wherever and whenever they pleased, was one of their greatest advantages. To truly protect his kingdom, Alfred realized that he needed to confront the Vikings in their own element, the sea. This realization led to one of his most audacious and innovative reforms, the creation of an Anglo-Saxon naval fleet. Imagine a scene of large-scale shipbuilding. Unlike the Viking longships with their sleek, symmetrical design, Alfred's vessels were designed to be larger, more stable, and crucially, taller. These Anglo-Saxon longships were not built for speedy raiding, but for naval battle and troop transport. We can see men, Anglo-Saxons aged between 20 and 50 of various European ethnicities, with varying hair and eyes dressed in period work clothes, working on the docks, the rhythmic sound of hammers hitting wood, the smell of tar and freshly cut timber wafting through the air. The massive hulls are being shaped, the sturdy wool sails are being sewn, and the heavier oars are being prepared for battle. Alfred, a man 30s-40s with light brown hair and blue eyes, his expression thoughtful and focused, and dressed in royal robes that convey authority but also practicality, is seen observing the proceedings. He is perhaps in a makeshift shipyard, on the Wessex coast or along an estuary. He is discussing with the shipwrights, men experienced in their craft but who now face the task of creating a new type of warship. Alfred's objective is clear: to intercept the Vikings before they can land, or to engage them in naval combat in coastal and river waters, denying them the surprise and freedom of movement that had so benefited them. Although there is little record of the naval victories of Alfred's fleet, the very fact of its existence was a deterrent. He was the first Anglo-Saxon king to invest seriously in a navy, setting a precedent for future English monarchs to follow. His vessels, with their higher sides, were more difficult to board and offered a superior platform for archers and marksmen. The sight of Anglo-Saxon longships sailing the rivers and coast must have been a sign of hope to his people and of alarm to the Vikings. Alfred's fleet not only protected the waters of Wessex, but also projected the strength of his kingdom beyond its lands, demonstrating a strategic vision that encompassed all the domains of his kingdom. He was, in effect, laying the foundation for English naval power. After years of incessant warfare against the Vikings, Anglo-Saxon England was on the brink of collapse not only militarily and politically, but also culturally and educationally. Monasteries, once beacons of learning and repositories of precious manuscripts, had been looted and burned. Many clergy and scholars had been killed or fled, and Latin, the language of the church and scholarship, was in decline. Literacy itself was at risk. Alfred the Great, who deeply valued knowledge, saw this as an existential threat to the future of his people and embarked on an ambitious program of educational revival. Imagine images that transport the viewer into the heart of these centers of learning. We see the interiors of scriptoriums, writing rooms in monasteries, lit by flickering candles and soft light streaming through small windows. Monks, men between 30 and 60 years old of various ethnicities with their hair shaved in tonsure style, wearing simple but dignified clerical robes, and scribes, men between 20 and 50 years old dressed in simple wool and linen robes, are hunched over rough wooden tables, their faces intent. Their ink-stained hands hold goose quills, meticulously copying and illuminating ancient manuscripts. The air is filled with the smell of beeswax, parchment, and ink. Alfred not only encouraged this revival, he led it. He lamented that very few of my own people could understand Latin, an insurmountable barrier to access to knowledge. To address this, he established schools for young nobles and talented commoners, ensuring that they were educated in both Old English and Latin. He also invited and attracted scholars from across the European continent, such as Grimbold and John, to his court, offering them protection and resources so that they could teach and translate. The learning and working environment in the schools and monasteries that Alfred had revitalized would be vibrant but also serene. The light of learning, which had previously flickered, now burned with a new intensity. Alfred's goal was clear: to preserve the culture, faith, and intellect of his people, not only for his own generation but for future generations. He believed that a strong kingdom needed not only warriors and laws, but also a solid foundation of knowledge and spirituality. This commitment to education, in a time of profound instability, marks Alfred not only as a great military leader, but as a king with a holistic vision for the prosperity of his nation, ensuring that the light of scholarship never dimmed in England. Alfred the Great's commitment to the educational revival in England was not just a royal policy, it was a personal passion. Unlike many monarchs of his time, whose education was limited to basic military and religious training, Alfred devoted himself to learning throughout his life. He deeply regretted the decline of Latin and the scarcity of Old English texts, which made knowledge inaccessible to most of his people and even to many clergy. To combat this gap, Alfred not only sponsored scholars, he became one himself, taking on the monumental task of translating crucial Latin texts into Old English. Imagine an intimate close-up of Alfred, a man in his 40s or 50s with light brown hair and blue eyes that show a deep intelligence and perhaps a slight weariness from long hours of study. His beard, now shorter and flecked with gray, denotes wisdom. He wears royal robes but noticeably simpler and more practical for study, without excessive adornment, perhaps a heavy woolen cloak over a linen tunic. He is seated at a simple wooden desk, lit by natural light from a window or by the soft flame of a candle. He has a Latin book in front of him, its pages worn with age, and a goose quill in his hand, with which he meticulously writes on another parchment, this time in Old English. The process of translation was no easy task. It was a laborious task that required not only a command of Latin, but also a deep understanding of the theology, philosophy, and history contained in the texts. Alfred translated fundamental works that shaped Western thought, such as Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, a philosophical work he valued for its lessons on divine providence and the nature of happiness in times of adversity, which resonated deeply with his own experiences. He also translated Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, which was essential to the identity and history of his own people, and parts of the Bible and St. Augustine's soliloquies. Alfred's passion for learning was evident in every stroke of his pen. He was not just a copyist, but an interpreter, adapting texts to make them understandable to a wider audience, often adding his own commentary and reflections. This dedication to translation not only preserved knowledge but democratized it, making it accessible to a much wider audience. Alfred the Translator was as crucial to the formation of England as Alfred the Warrior. He built bridges between the past and the future, between classical learning and Anglo-Saxon culture, ensuring that the minds and spirits of his people were nourished as much as their lands were defended. Amid Alfred the Great's efforts to revive scholarship and strengthen the cultural identity of his kingdom, one of his most enduring and invaluable initiatives was his encouragement of the compilation and maintenance of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. This collection of annals, which records the history of England from the arrival of the first Anglo-Saxons until well after Alfred's reign, is one of the most vital primary sources for the study of that period. It was not just a record, it was a conscious effort to preserve the memory of a people and their deeds in times of great turmoil. Imagine images of a scribe, a man in his 30s or 40s dressed in the simple, functional robes of a monk or cleric, his face illuminated by natural light from a window or the flame of a candle, sitting at a wooden table, meticulously writing on ancient parchment. His goose quill scratches the pages with precision, the Anglo-Saxon letters, runes, and Latin characters, emerging in an elegant and orderly fashion. The soft sound of the quill scraping the parchment would be the only noise in a room dedicated to preserving the past. The ambiance of the scriptorium, it would be modest, but imbued with an atmosphere of reverence for knowledge. Alfred did not simply sponsor the chronicle, he pushed it forward. Although he did not write it himself, he probably oversaw its beginnings and encouraged its continuation, perhaps even dictating certain sections or providing input. The chronicle was not a single book, but a series of manuscripts copied in different monasteries, each adding its own entries and perspectives, but all sharing a common core that traced the history of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Its purpose was to record important events, the arrivals of the Vikings, battles, the deaths of kings, royal marriages, the appointments of bishops, and of course the deeds of Alfred himself. The chronicle's creation was not just an academic exercise, it was an act of cultural affirmation. At a time when Anglo-Saxon identity was under threat from Viking rule, having a written history, a continuous narrative that stretched back centuries of kingship and Christian faith, was a powerful tool for morale and social cohesion. It provided a sense of belonging and a shared past, reinforcing the idea that despite invasions, Anglo-Saxon heritage was worthy of preservation and celebration. This monumental work remains, to this day, the clearest and most detailed voice of Anglo-Saxon England, a lasting legacy of Alfred's vision for a kingdom that would not be defined solely by its military victories, but also by its rich and ongoing history. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is, in fact, the story that Alfred helped to ensure would be told. Alfred the Great's vision for a renewed England went far beyond battlefields and fortifications. He understood that for a kingdom to truly thrive, it needed to be a center of knowledge, not just military power. With this goal in mind, Alfred transformed his own royal court into a vibrant center of learning, a magnet that attracted the brightest scholars and clergy from across Western Europe, creating an environment of debate, study, and cultural production unprecedented in Anglo-Saxon England. Imagine a scene from the court of Alfred, a man in his 40s or 50s, his light brown hair now streaked with gray, and his blue eyes sparkling with intelligence and insatiable curiosity. He is dressed in royal robes, but elegant and functional, without the ostentation that demonstrates both his authority and his dedication to simplicity. He is not simply seated on a throne, he is actively engaged, perhaps at a desk, surrounded by a variety of scholars, clergy, and nobles, men of varying ages and appearances, many in clerical robes or noble attire, with serious and thoughtful expressions. The atmosphere is one of intellectual effervescence. Scrolls are scattered about, candlelight and lanterns illuminate faces, and the murmur of voices in Latin and Old English as they debate and discuss texts and ideas. These luminaries included Asser, a Welsh monk who became Alfred's biographer, and one of his closest advisors, Grimbold, a Frankish priest and scholar, and John, a Saxon monk who brought with him a wealth of knowledge. Alfred invited them to Wessex, offering them protection, patronage, and most importantly, an environment in which they could flourish intellectually. He challenged them to translate texts, to teach, and to revive the scholarship that had been lost. He himself sat with them, not as a king issuing orders, but as an eager student, participating in discussions, asking questions, and absorbing knowledge. This court of scholars was not just a symbol of prestige, it was an engine of transformation. It provided the translations of important works, the teachings of a new generation of clergy and administrators, and the impetus for the creation of historical records such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Knowledge, once confined to a few isolated and threatened monasteries, was now at the heart of royal power, protected and promoted by the king himself. Alfred's court thus became a beacon of learning in an age of darkness, demonstrating that the true strength of a kingdom lay not only in its weapons but in the wisdom and culture of its people. Alfred the Great did not merely defend his kingdom, he cultivated its mind. Despite his monumental importance, Alfred the Great was not the complete unifier of England in the modern sense of the word. He failed to drive all the Vikings from the island, nor to restore Anglo-Saxon control over all the kingdoms that had fallen under Danish rule. However, his vision and achievements laid the foundation for eventual unification, making him the essential founder of an idea of England that before him had been merely a mosaic of regional identities. The division imposed by the Treaty of Wedmore, although a harsh reality, served paradoxically as the catalyst for this new conception. Imagine a map of England being displayed, where the divisions between the territories are vivid. Wessex and Western Mercia, the lands under Alfred's firm control, shine in a deep green, symbolizing vitality and sovereignty. In sharp contrast, the Danelaw, the eastern and northeastern regions where the Vikings ruled and their laws prevailed, are shown in a deep red, denoting a distinct political and cultural reality. Yet, across this division, a faint but visible line begins to emerge, connecting these areas, as if a new entity were slowly emerging on the horizon. This line represents the idea of a greater England, a unity that transcended the present divisions. Alfred did not see a completely united England under his scepter, but he planted the seeds for it. He called himself King of the English and Saxons, King of the Angles and Saxons, a title that suggested authority over all Anglo-Saxon peoples, even those living under Viking rule, expressing his ambition to reunite all Anglo-Saxon lands. His military and educational reforms were not limited to Wessex alone. They had a moral and practical impact on Anglo-Saxons in all parts of the island, inspiring them to maintain their faith and identity. He created an army and a fleet that were more than just defensive. They were tools of reconquest for his successors. He created a model of governance, law, and culture that his descendants could build upon. His children and grandchildren, such as Edward the Elder and Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, would build on this foundation, leading military and diplomatic campaigns to gradually reconquer the Danelaw and integrate these lands under a single Anglo-Saxon crown. Alfred was the great protector of Anglo-Saxon identity and Christian culture at a critical time, ensuring that there was something to unify. He consolidated a power base, established a legacy of resilience and intelligence, and lit the flame of a national identity that his successors would eventually transform into a unified kingdom. He did not unite England entirely, but he saved it and founded it as we know it today. The reign of Alfred the Great was a period of profound and visionary rebuilding that extended far beyond military defense. While Viking raids had devastated the Anglo-Saxon infrastructure and economy, Alfred implemented policies that not only sought security, but also prosperity and order in his kingdom. He understood that a strong nation depended as much on its walls as on the vitality of its people. His lasting legacy is the image of a nation in the making, rising from the ashes of war. We can visualize images of lush cultivated fields where peasants, men and women of various ages, of European ethnicities dressed in simple rustic linen and wool clothing, their faces sweaty and focused but with an expression of renewed confidence, work in harmony, plowing the land, planting seeds and harvesting grain. The soft sound of plows and the chirping of birds fill the air, contrasting with the din of war that once dominated. In another scene, artisans, men and women between 20 and 50 years old, dressed in more elaborate work clothes, their hands skilled in handling tools, are busy in workshops inside the newly built bursor in fortified villages. We see blacksmiths forging tools and weapons, weavers producing cloth, and potters shaping pottery. The sound of hammers and looms and the smell of freshly worked metal and wood demonstrate a vibrant economy and recovery. Alfred encouraged trade, protected markets within his spurs, and promoted the minting of high-quality silver coins, which became a standard of value and trust, facilitating transactions and economic growth. He knew that social stability was as important as military stability. He restored and encouraged the development of towns and cities that had been abandoned or destroyed, providing protection and opportunities for people to return and prosper. Rebuilding infrastructure was a collective effort, driven by the king's leadership. Alfred's legacy is that of a kingdom that, under his leadership, not only survived but flourished. He was not content to simply repel his enemies. He worked tirelessly to build a safer, more educated, and more prosperous society. The order under his reign was a symbol of stability and long-term vision. The images of peasants and artisans working in peace and with the benefit of royal protection are a vivid testament to how Alfred paved the way for a stronger and more united nation. England, from a land of refuge and ruin, was being transformed into a land of renewal and opportunity, thanks to the nation builder that was Alfred. Alfred the Great was not just a warrior and a scholar. He was a leader who understood the importance of law and justice to the cohesion and prosperity of a kingdom. After years of war and disorder, in which laws had been broken and royal authority had been undermined, Alfred undertook an ambitious legal reform. His goal was to restore order, ensure justice for all his subjects, and establish a clear code of conduct by which his people could be governed. This was no small task, for the existing laws were fragmented and inconsistent. We can visualize a formal but approachable scene of Alfred, a man in his 40s or 50s, with his light brown hair and blue eyes, now with a gray beard that gives him an air of authority and wisdom. He is dressed in royal robes, more solemn, perhaps adorned with some simple embroidery, seated on a throne of carved wood, but not overly opulent. He is presiding over a moot, a legal assembly, or a court. Beside you, perhaps, there are some of your thanes, loyal nobles and clerics, all with serious and attentive expressions. The scene would show Alfred listening attentively to the petitions of his subjects, men and women of various ages and social classes, with expressions of hope or despair, who approach him to present their grievances and disputes. He is not just a distant judge, but an approachable king who seeks to understand the root of conflicts. The air in the room would be charged with anticipation, but also with a new sense of fairness. Alfred is portrayed as a monarch who cared about justice for his people, seeking the truth and applying the law impartially. He compiled a new legal code, known as the Laws of Alfred, Dambach, which was not a complete invention, but a harmonization and updating of the existing laws of his predecessors and other Anglo-Saxon traditions, with a strong foundation in Christian principles. His laws were clear, concise, and focused on preventing crime and maintaining social peace. He introduced graduated punishments and emphasized the importance of oaths and testimony. The aim was to create a legal system that was fair, understandable, and could be applied consistently throughout his kingdom. This legal reform was instrumental in consolidating royal authority, strengthening confidence in the justice system, and providing a stable foundation on which Anglo-Saxon society could rebuild itself. Alfred the Lawgiver ensured that order and justice were as important as military defense, thus cementing the foundations of his nation. After a 28-year reign marked by ceaseless struggle, visionary reforms, and a cultural renaissance, Alfred the Great, exhausted by war and the chronic illness that had plagued him throughout his life, died on October 26, 899. His death was a moment of profound mourning for the kingdom he had saved and transformed. The king who had defied fate and rewritten English history was finally laid to rest. We can see an Anglo-Saxon tomb, possibly a simple but dignified construction of stone or wood, adorned with Christian and Anglo-Saxon symbols. The day is bright, but the atmosphere is one of solemnity and respect. A small funeral procession, consisting of his sons and heirs, Edward the Elder and Ethelfled, loyal clergy, men 40-60 in clerical robes, and some of his thanes, men 30-50, in clean armor and symbols of mourning, walk slowly toward the burial site. Their faces, though saddened, also reflect deep gratitude and recognition of the greatness of the departed king. There is no despair. There is a solemn acceptance of a life well lived and an undeniable legacy. News of his death spread throughout Wessex and beyond, even reaching the Danish settlements in the Danelaw. To the Anglo-Saxons, it was the loss of a protector, a father to his people. To the Vikings, it was the end of a formidable adversary, a king who had proven himself to be an unparalleled strategist and leader. Alfred had ensured that Wessex would not only survive but thrive, leaving a stronger and more cohesive kingdom to his successors. His death did not mark the end of the struggle against the Vikings, but rather the point at which the balance of power had tipped irreversibly in favor of the Anglo-Saxons. Alfred's legacy was already firmly established. He had not only defended his kingdom with the sword, but had rebuilt it with his mind, his faith, and his law. He left behind not only a throne, but a vision of a united England, a reformed army, a network of fortresses, an educational renaissance, and a body of law that would serve as a foundation for the future. His death, though the end of one era, was also the beginning of another, paving the way for the eventual complete unification of England. Alfred's tomb was not a symbol of defeat, but of lasting triumph, the final resting place of the king who had saved and forged his nation. The death of Alfred the Great in 899 AD did not mean the end of his vision for England. On the contrary, it was the starting point for his successors, trained and inspired by his legacy, to continue and ultimately complete the work of unification he had begun. His sons, Edward the Elder and his granddaughter, Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, were the chief architects of the reconquest of the Danelaw and the creation of a unified English kingdom, a direct testament to the solid foundation laid by Alfred. We can see images that show the continuity of this line of leaders. First, the figure of his son, Edward the Elder, a man in his 30s or 40s, with blonde hair and blue eyes, dressed in more developed and elegant, but still practical, Anglo-Saxon armor. He is depicted leading troops with the same discipline and determination as his father, building more burhs, and methodically advancing against Viking settlements. Edward was a formidable warrior and a tireless builder, who extended the borders of Wessex to the north and east. At her side, and equally important, is her granddaughter Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, a woman in her 30s or 40s, with dark brown hair and piercing green eyes, dressed in light Anglo-Saxon armor, symbolic of her leadership, perhaps with a tunic underneath. Ethelfled was a military and political leader of remarkable ability, who ruled Mercia after her husband's death and worked closely with her brother Edward to retake the lands under Viking rule. She was a formidable military strategist, building burhs additional, and leading armies in battles against the Danes and Welsh. Images of her on the battlefield, commanding her troops, or in war councils, show her strength and intelligence, a true warrior queen. Together, Edward and Ethelfled executed what was essentially a grand strategy of reconquest, based on Alfred's principles. They advanced systematically, strengthening their borders, building burhs to protect territorial gains, and integrate the newly conquered populations. They not only expelled the Vikings, but also established a new model of governance for the recaptured lands. Their collaboration was crucial to the success of the venture. Alfred's influence extended beyond military tactics. His successors inherited his passion for learning and his vision of a united England under a Christian crown. They continued to promote law and order, and to foster Anglo-Saxon culture. Alfred's dynasty, the House of Wessex, would eventually become the Royal House of England, ruling over a kingdom that would eventually achieve full unification under his direct heirs, including Aethelstan, the first king of all England. The light that Alfred lit shone brightly through his descendants, ensuring that his work would not be in vain, but rather the foundation for the birth of a nation. The figure of Alfred the Great has transcended the centuries, remaining firmly rooted in the collective memory of England and the world as one of the greatest leaders in history. He is not just a character in history books, but an icon of resilience, intelligence, and leadership in times of crisis. His permanence in culture is attested to by various forms of homage and representation, which keep him alive in the public consciousness. Imagine a series of photographs or vignettes of modern statues of Alfred the Great. The most famous is perhaps the imposing bronze statue in Winchester, the ancient capital of Wessex, where he is depicted in a heroic pose, holding a sword and shield, his bearded, determined face looking to the future. Other representations might be in Wantage, his hometown, or in museums, each capturing a different facet of his persona. These statues, usually made of bronze or stone, exude an aura of dignity and strength, inviting contemplation of his legacy. But Alfred's cultural presence extends beyond statues. His name echoes in the names of streets, schools, pubs, and even football clubs across England. He is a central figure in historical novels, poems, operas, and, more recently, television series and video games that have introduced him to new generations. His image, often idealized, resonates with the leadership qualities that are valued in any era: the ability to inspire one's people, to overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges, and to build something lasting in the face of adversity. The story of the burning of the cakes, though possibly apocryphal, is a perfect example of how Alfred became a human and approachable figure even in his greatness. He is the king who made common mistakes, who suffered, and who rose again. This blend of heroism and humanity is what makes him so endearing. He is the symbol of English resistance against invasion, the defender of English culture and language at a time when they could have been lost forever. His image evokes a time of founding and a struggle for identity. Alfred the Great is more than a 9th century king. He is a living legend, a timeless reminder that true greatness lies in the ability to defend what is essential, to innovate in the face of danger, and to inspire a people to believe in their own future. His collective memory does not diminish. It grows stronger with each generation that discovers the story of the king who saved England. Few monarchs in British, or indeed world history, have been given the epithet, the Great. For Alfred, this title was not a self-proclamation, but a posthumous designation, a recognition that would not come until centuries after his death. It was in the 16th century, during the Protestant Reformation, that he was officially coined Alfred the Great by historians and thinkers, largely because of his image as a defender of the Christian faith and English identity against pagan invaders. This epithet, however, is more than an honorary title. It is a summation of an extraordinary reign and a multifaceted legacy. We can visualize a sequence of historical texts and sagas, illustrated in medieval calligraphy and illuminations, or as pages from ancient books. The words Alfredus Magnus or Alfred the Great appear prominently, perhaps in Latin and Old English, with a subtle glow, highlighting his importance in the historiography. These sources, many of them compiled or inspired by his own time, such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, were the first to record his deeds and pave the way for his reputation. Alfred's title of Great is not based solely on his military victories. Although the Battle of Edington was decisive, his greatness lies in his vision and leadership on all fronts. He did not merely defeat the Vikings, he engaged and transformed them, forging a tense peace with the Treaty of Wedmore. He did not merely defend his kingdom, he rebuilt it, with the innovative network of bourse and the military reorganization that created a professional and always ready army. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of his greatness is his commitment to culture and learning. In an age of darkness, he lit the light of scholarship, translating texts, encouraging education, and promoting law and justice. He was a philosopher king, a scholar king, who understood that the strength of a nation lies not only in its arms, but also in its wisdom and moral cohesion. His rule laid the foundations for the unified England that would come to be. The epithet, the Great, is a recognition of his unwavering resilience, his strategic intelligence, and his passion for his people and culture. He is a beacon of leadership in times of adversity, an example of how vision and determination can not only save, but transform a nation. He was given the title, the Great, because he did indeed accomplish great deeds that shaped the destiny of England in ways few kings ever could. His legacy endures, and his greatness is an inspiring reminder of the power of a leader with vision. Behind the imposing figure of Alfred the Great, the military strategist and the king, lawgiver and scholar, there was a a man with his virtues and his weaknesses, his pains and his passions. The complexity of his character is what makes him one of the most fascinating figures in history, transcending myth to reveal the essence of a leader who, despite the overwhelming pressures of his time, maintained a deep humanity and a sense of purpose. We can end with a final close-up of Alfredo's face, a man in his 40s or 50s, with his light brown hair now flecked with gray and deep blue eyes, which convey not only intelligence, but a serene compassion and an existential weariness. His beard, now fuller, adds to his dignity. His expression is serious but with a hint of melancholy, perhaps of someone who has carried the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders for too long, but who has also found peace in his duty fulfilled. Alfred was a man of deep Christian faith. His religiosity was not just political, but a personal conviction that guided his decisions. He sought divine wisdom and saw his challenges as tests of his faith. Asser, his biographer, tells us of his diligence in prayer and his desire to live a righteous life. However, he also suffered from a chronic illness, possibly Crohn's disease, which caused him intense and constant pain throughout his life. This physical pain, although a trial, may have forged an unusual resilience and empathy in a king. He was no stranger to suffering, which may have made him more compassionate toward his people. He was a brilliant strategist, but also an approachable leader who knew how to inspire loyalty. His temper, it is said, could be intense, but it was tempered by a strong sense of justice and a desire to serve. He cared deeply about the education of his people, not out of mere whim, but because he believed that knowledge was essential to the salvation of their souls and the prosperity of his kingdom. His passion for personal learning and the translation of texts reveals a restless intellect and a relentless quest for wisdom. Alfred was not infallible, and the legend of the burnt cakes, however apocryphal, serves as a reminder of his humanity and his distractions in moments of deep concern. He was a man who failed, but always rose again. The look that conveyed intelligence and resilience, the complexity of a character who was at once a warrior, a scholar, a lawgiver, and a father to his people, is what elevates him beyond a mere ruler to become a legendary figure. He was, at his core, the king, who through his strength of character and his vision, not only saved his kingdom but shaped it, and in the process, forged the very identity of a nation. The story of Alfred the Great culminates not only in his death, but in the materialization of a legacy that resonates through the centuries, the birth of a nation, England. Although he did not witness the complete unification of the kingdom, his deeds were the indispensable foundation upon which his successors were able to build a united England with a strong and enduring national identity. Without his tireless resilience, his visionary reforms, and his passion for culture, the political and cultural landscape of the island would have been drastically different, and England as we know it today might not even exist. Finally, we have a final map that lights up with increasing intensity. Starting with the Kingdom of Wessex in green and the Danelaw in red, the colors gradually blend, with the red retracting while the green expanding, covering the entire island of Great Britain east of Wales. The name England appears prominently, written in a typeface that evokes dignity and antiquity, perhaps in gold or a shade that stands out against the unified green. Small flags bearing the Wessex dragon, a symbol that would evolve into the English flag, fly at strategic points on the map, symbolizing sovereignty and unity. Alfred was the pivot. He was the king who, when hopelessness hung over his people, refused to give up. He didn't just stand up to the Viking armies that threatened to destroy everything. He studied them, adapted to their tactics, and ultimately overcame them. His spurs became the backbone of a national defense. His reformed army ensured that his people were always ready. His naval fleet began to dominate the waters. But his greatest contribution, perhaps, was the cultivation of the Anglo-Saxon mind and spirit. By sponsoring education, translating crucial texts, and compiling the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, he ensured that the culture, language, and history of his people would not be lost, but rather strengthened and preserved for future generations. The message is clear. England, as a political and cultural entity, owes its existence and its fundamental identity to Alfred. He not only saved his kingdom from annihilation, but forged the instruments, military, legal, and cultural, that would enable his heirs to complete its unification. The nation that today prides itself on its history and language has its roots firmly planted in the seeds that Alfred the Great sowed in times of war and despair. He is without doubt the founding father of one of Europe's oldest and most influential nations.